Welcome to the NCO Journal podcast, where we explore NCO professional development. This is a podcast series where we discuss published articles with authors and provide a forum for the open exchange of ideas, information, and solutions. I'm your host, Chago Zapata, Managing Editor of the NCO Journal. And with us is Sergeant First Class Osvaldo Aquite, NCOIC of the Journal. Today we discuss the article COIN, Don't Trade Blood for Knowledge, by Sergeant Major Timothy D. Haar, Operations NCO, 52nd Ordnance Group. Before we kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Like you said, I'm Sergeant Major Timothy Haar. I currently work at the 52nd Ordnance Group, EOD. Just hit 21 years in the Army, and I've been EOD the entire time. Graduated from the Sergeant Major Academy last year, and I've been working here as a Brigade Operations Sergeant Major for about a year now.
Okay, well, tell us about this. Why did you choose to write this article? What was the thought process behind choosing to write this article?
Sir, I could see, obviously, the Army shifting its focus toward large-scale combat operations, and I absolutely agree with that. What worried me was that we have NCOs with years or decades of experience within this realm, and if we completely shift that focus to LSCO, we may hamper the information transfer from those NCOs to their subordinates on some of those key lessons that we learned in the COIN fights in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I decided to when I finished reading it, I saw the very last words of your article. I thought they just stuck in my head. You know, don't trade blood for knowledge. As actually the title of your article. What'd you think of our choice?
It was certainly the words that I wrote that hit home the most to me, because for those of us that were maybe in Iraq or Afghanistan in the early years, I think we saw a lot of lessons that we had to learn, hard lessons, and unfortunately we learned them through somebody being killed or injured, and then we were able to change our SOPs, our TTPs, and hopefully move on in that ever-evolving fight against an insurgency. And so that's essentially why I wanted to write the paper. I want to be very, very clear that I'm not an old NCO pushing back against change. We're moving to LSCO. But I was 19 years old when I was first deployed in Fallujah. My experiences at that age and at that time did a lot to sort of form my worldview right now. But I'm completely on board with the current focus on LSCO. I simply think that it's important that we as an NCO Corps retain the lessons learned from our really extensive COIN operation experience, because I do believe they're going to be very important during the future fight.
I'd like to hear, maybe if it takes you a second to kind of think back on this a little bit, that's fine. But I'd like to hear probably what was your first experience as a young NCO or maybe even the soldier, like you said, first deploying to Fallujah with COIN operations?
The first experience that really comes to mind, like I said, I was in the 703rd EOD out of Fort Knox. We got to Fallujah in September of 2003, and that's right when the IEDs hadn't spiked there yet, right? And so I'm an EOD soldier. We take care of improvised explosive devices, and now all of a sudden they are rampant within the theater. And we drove into Fallujah the first time, and I saw a fellow EOD technician have to almost just run in, clip onto it, do a remote pull, tear this it was a propane tank filled with HME, and tore this thing apart, and we got out of there in probably less than 10 minutes because the insurgents there enjoyed shooting at you if you spent too long there. And then we drove out of the city, and I thought, this is nothing like EOD school. I had just graduated about a month prior, and was taken aback at how different the the very organized learning within TRADOC of how to do your job. And then 6 weeks later, I'm watching it in action for the first time, and just the chaos of having to safely take this thing apart, while also worrying about all the other tactical concerns. And so it was a very eye-opening scene for me to take in.
One of the things you just said really, really stuck in my head here about, there was some hard lessons that we learned over the course of the global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the lessons need to be passed on.
Well, I would say that I've had similar thoughts over the years, and I would hesitate to say that they were made in vain, because I think it would be difficult to truly comprehend. I can speak toward the EOD side, right? So if an EOD team leader on the ground in 2003 to 2004 figured something out on about what the enemy was doing, and then put that information out to the maneuver forces on the ground, and I've seen that happen several times. Get the intel, analyze it, and then pass that information on to whoever you are supporting, and then I don't know, there would be no way to truly understand how many lives that can save. And then it's a cascading effect, because those people whose lives were saved can now pass that experience pass that on throughout the decades. And so even if we were to forget everything that we know about COIN right now, I think that the lessons that we learned from those sacrifices could not be in vain, because of the other lives that were saved just in those fights in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, great point. Yeah, absolutely. What I mean is, like, when it comes to like future fight, those hard lessons, they weren't in vain when they happened, but now those hard lessons that were learned, if they're not passed on, and you warriors who've been out there, who were out there doing, in the dirt, doing everything that needed to be done, don't have the opportunity to pass on that knowledge. That's what I'm thinking, is that it would be in vain as far as that aspect of it.
No, I absolutely understand your point, sir. And I think we can see just in the news reports coming out of Ukraine that there's a lot of guerrilla tactics, some used on both sides. And so I think during large-scale combat operations, we have to be aware of the core of that COIN fight, that counterinsurgency fight, because it's not just made up of how we should fight against just an insurgency. A lot of those tasks that are associated with it, or lessons learned from it, apply to guerrilla tactics within a LSCO fight. So I think that was really the point of my paper, is to say don't stop doing LSCO training, but understand that you're going to have to do some COIN-centric tasks within that LSCO fight, and we might not be realizing that on a large scale here.
This brings up a point too. We worked with Sergeant Major of the Army, Sergeant Major Grinston, before he retired, a final series of visits to different places, and he always brought up tough, realistic training. Could you talk a little more about that? Because I think it's important that we stick to, or that we explore, how this is relevant to NCOs, because those are the people who are listening to our podcast.
I think that the tough, realistic training that you're talking about is especially important for the COIN operations associated with large-scale combat operations. We saw that previously, or historically, when we would start going to JRTC and NTC, and they were not built toward the COIN fight, the Army had difficulties adjusting those training centers, and they had to bring in role players, because there's I think we realized that there was a lot more of the human element when you're dealing with COIN than there is with LSCO. But I think that human element persists throughout all combat operations, right? The reason that we're fighting over a piece of land is likely that land means something to someone. And so as we're moving through fighting one of these near peers, may our folks end up in villages, towns, cities, well, yes, absolutely, we are going to fight there. And so that once you're there, now there will be interaction with the civilians, which makes everything that you're doing more complex. And now commanders can't give specific orders for every contingency, so we need to use mission command principles, right? And we have to allow our NCOs to exercise their initiative on the battlefield, obviously through the chain of command. But if we're not training for these sort of complex COIN operations in conjunction with LSCO, then my fear is that the young sergeants and staff sergeants, and even some sergeants first class, who may not have that experience dealing with the local populace while also doing combat operations, then we lose that. And that's why I wrote the article.
Yeah, if we talk, it seems that we've already talked about the shape phase. Going back to your article, we're talking about the different phases of the joint combat operation model. We're talking about shape. We probably didn't touch on the deter phase, but those kind of go together and they kind of blend in sometimes, because you can say, a deployment overseas is a show of force kind of thing. So that's part of a deter phase. And we touched a little bit about the dominate phase, but now we're talking a little bit more on the stabilize and enable civil authorities phases of the joint operation. And if we're talking about in reality, right, in reality, we may need to skip some of those phases and just go into a country and provide stability or aid those countries stabilize themselves, or even do some enable civil authorities, right? The military might be called to support those operations. And that's where we're talking about NCOs playing a big role with COIN operations. They have to have that understanding and realize that some of their actions might have strategic implications.
Yes, sir. I completely agree. And I think what you're saying makes perfect sense, in that if something new happened in the world right now, and we had been doing maybe some security cooperation type operations there in the past, right? So like security force assistance, going through and training the military of a host nation, and then we send in a large number of people. That's getting us into deter with a flexible deterrent option or flexible response option, right? We're moving into the spot, and then there is no fight. Then yes, we're jumping right into stabilize, right? We're making sure that essential services are provided, and if any key infrastructure has been broken, we're making sure that it's good. Well, the hazard of that is that yes, we're doing a good thing while we're there, but then, in my opinion, our priorities then become our enemy's opportunities, right? So if I need to keep the local populace alive, essentially, right? They need clean water, they need food, they need electricity. And so we, through our protection warfighting function, work to make sure that those things stay on. Well, the enemy only has to get it right once. So they are able to, using maybe drones or artillery or whatever they would like to use, they destroy the water plant or make it so that the folks in and around that area can't get water. Well, now we're the face of the operation, and this town doesn't have any water, which can turn the local populace against us. And one interesting thing that I found in doing the research for this article, in JP 324, it said that only 20 people per 1,000 are needed, and that's our estimates as a military, but 20 people per 1,000 are needed to sustain an insurgency. And that number seemed so low to me. I always assumed it would be higher. But every interaction that we have where a soldier hasn't been trained correctly on ROE, and a vehicle drives up and they fire on the vehicle, or animals are injured because of our reckless driving, or an interaction just goes poorly when you're talking to a mayor or an elder of a village. If each of those interactions simply turns one person against us, we're going to get to that number 20 in 1,000 pretty quickly, and now there's a sustained counterinsurgency in our area. So that, to me, just knowing the hazards of those things is important, because now you're not telling the young sergeant isn't telling the private, don't do this, and I'm not telling you why. You get to say, this is how we're going to interact in situations like this, and here's why. Because if we don't, then you're a private now, but we're going to come back here as a sergeant and a staff sergeant and a sergeant first class fighting this same war.
No, you bring up a good point, because it's in those basic soldier skills like treatment of suspects or whatever. Just in that simple interaction, while you may think we got this suspected insurgent or whatever, but if you don't treat them right or with respect or dignity, and they end up not being the person, right, the person that you were looking for, like you said, it can turn them toward that it can drive them toward that insurgency, and you're kind of repeating the same mistakes again. So I think you hit it on the nail there, that we have to focus on some of the not only realistic training, but also explain or take those opportunities in training to explain why these things are important and why they matter and what kind of implications they might have.
Yes, and I think that those key interactions, yes, the battalion commander, the brigade commander, division commander are going to have interactions with people in that host nation, and those are larger, sometimes strategic level engagements, and they are incredibly important. But the interactions that would turn somebody toward an insurgency, in my opinion, are those interactions led by teams, squads, platoons, and then sometimes companies, right? And so most of those are sort of NCO led and trained, especially from the platoon level on down, right? So if we don't have the NCOs passing that information on, then the lieutenant colonels, generals could be saying all of the right things at their level, but we are effectively starting an insurgency at the team, squad, and platoon level. And so, yes, I think that it becomes very important. I know that I've made some maybe poor decisions in the past on how an EOD problem could have been handled and not handled, and I want others that have learned those lessons to be able to pass them on to the next generation.
There is training going on, though, but the Army does have COIN training. And that was one of the things that came up in a conversation. Could you speak on that a little bit, Sergeant Nikita?
Yeah, I mean, so we're obviously doing training, at your leadership courses. They're talking about soldier leader engagements, right? You're talking about engagements in the battlefield. So there's a lot of that training that's happening. But I think the point that I'm trying to reach here is that there's a lot of downtime. When we're eating chow, there's time to talk, and it's like, hey, you kind of review your actions on contact and things like that, and you say, hey, you know what, I saw you doing something, XYZ. You know what that could mean? You know what I mean? Like, so taking those opportunities as an NCO to impart, especially those that have that combat experience, to impart those, hey, this is what I learned in.
Wait.
Right. Like,
Give us a real world example. You were out there in Iraq. Why don't you give us a real example about that? That would be interesting for me to hear.
Well,
for the audience to hear.
But we would go into a home, and we would, I was in infantry, so we would go into a home. We would clear. We'd separate the women and children. Kids are crying. The guy is trying to protect his family. You know what I mean? So just yelling and pulling people aside, pulling the males aside, and you're young, so you're going in there, your heart's racing, you think everything's a threat, and you don't think about how you're treating people, and so maybe those instances, now looking back at them, I was like, man, I should have probably not been that rough with somebody. I probably shouldn't have. Could have understood them being together in the same room. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So those kind of things is the things that I think about when I'm thinking, if I'm doing training with a soldier and we're talking about clearing rooms and we're separating detainees and things like that, I would say, you know what, if there's an older man there and they're not the person we're looking for, and we want to have them over there with the family, with the women and children, like, do that if you can, right? Like,
well, you said
clear them, you know what I mean?
Dignity and respect, treating people with dignity and respect, regardless.
Yeah.
I think that's always important, no matter what.
And for us, it wasn't a thing that we trained on, or we talked about before going. We went in 2002, 2003. We weren't talking about. We always talked about dignity and respect, but when you're focusing on training, you're focusing on kicking doors and clearing rooms, right? But that's what I'm saying. Like, take that opportunity to pass on that knowledge. I don't know if that makes.
It makes absolute sense to me.
I agree. I think one thing that's sort of interesting is I jotted it down in preparation for this discussion, is just the lethal versus less lethal options, right? And so if we're hyper focused on the battle aspect of large scale combat operations, right? Deploying to a spot and destroying our nation's enemies, that is our main task, and that is incredibly important. But I think that you're right that in downtime, in an AAR or something like that, you don't even have to have practiced something lethal versus less lethal. I think that can be a discussion, but now your soldiers, maybe they hear a story from you, and they get to hear how you saw something go awry where less lethal options should have worked. We had to learn those lessons in Iraq, and all of a sudden they're figuring out maybe pen flares work because the warning shots don't work, and maybe civilians are getting injured or whatever it is. Not only are people getting injured or killed on the battlefield, civilians, but it's also that soldier then feels likely not great mentally about a situation that they likely could not have been trained for, right? We talk about ROE, and you can say it all day long, but there are going to be situations that fall outside of your training. And so hopefully there are NCOs there on the ground exercising their initiative with this experience, these lessons that have been passed down from their senior NCOs to be able to say, hey, shoot or don't shoot based on my experience. If we just walk into every situation thinking we need to train these folks for war and nothing else, then I think we saw what happens on the backside when we hit phase 4 stability operations, and then trying to enable civil authority when there's a whole lot of angry folks from the host nation populace around us because of things that we've largely done.
What would you say are the takeaways, Sergeant Major, for let's break it down into possibly young NCOs or junior NCOs, and then maybe senior NCOs? If you can break down some takeaways from this conversation for them to, if they're listening, what do you think they should go back to your units and do or bring up?
I'll take the you said senior, but I'll take the old folks first, right? Because that's what I am. To me, it could be as simple as just sitting down and telling some stories of times that you ran into weird situations. I think that interjecting a little bit into a training event that training event still meets the commander's intent, but you can flavor a little bit with some of the COIN experiences that you've had in the past. And I think that people would be surprised by how much their soldiers, their young soldiers can pick up from those, especially if you highlight it during the AAR. The young soldiers, that's more difficult for me, especially I'm an ops sergeant major, and so I don't have a lot of interaction with the young soldiers. But I'll say, especially the junior NCOs, I've learned so much over my 21 years by simply asking people questions, right? It doesn't matter who they are, but I'm in the room with them. So rather than us just standing there awkwardly, I might as well ask them questions, being inquisitive. And so I think if those young sergeants are simply asking the NCOs above them, hey, can we turn this training event a little bit? This is what I'm planning for Sergeant's Time training. Could you talk a little bit about this? Or what would you interject into this to make it a little bit better? How can we pack this time full with the best, most realistic training that we can? And so it really comes down to, how do we transfer, if both sides do that, then we can hopefully successfully transfer that knowledge from the older generation to the younger generation, and hopefully, once again, not have to relearn those lessons the hard way in the next fight.
Thank you again for joining us. And thank you to our audience. Remember to put your knowledge to the page, submit articles, and get published with the NCO Journal. Don't forget to check out our webpage and follow us on social media. We'll catch you next time on the NCO Journal podcast.